Hysgéan an Cortailóireachta is éidir ceasa sa Áras stáit ficin tí, aine ileach agus ach go háirithe na daoine óga. Cuinn seochas arm héanagus ar ma bhain céile, saibhín 100,000 fáilte aire roimh go léir go Áras an Uachtaráin. Agus sa dhéan den Cortailóireachta trís líomhleat as an cólíofa sa táú san Gaeilge, san sean teang go an tír sean. Your Excellency, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies, Minister of State McEntee, and dear friends. I have already congratulated the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps on his competence in the 5,000-year-old Irish language. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all and your families to Áras an Uachtaráin. Tá fircin fóilseirh go dé teach an Uachtaráin, agus tá gcónaí mar bunim sa bhínas mé héanas iad atá gobarlam, teanamh as 1 uair a cás muidir a céile I rinne blianta. His Excellency, I must say may I very much begin by saying this as we enter 2017. My wish for each and every one of you and the citizens of your countries that you represent is what I wish for the people of Ireland, and what indeed the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps has wished. A year of peace, prosperity, and above all, given our current circumstances, a year of hope. So may I begin by conveying my thanks to His Excellency Most Reverend Charles Brown for his very kind words and good wishes for the new year. His Excellency represents a papacy which continued throughout 2016 to challenge not only growing inequalities and exclusions across our world, which I have often condemned on an occasion like this at the beginning of the year, but the papacy also questioned the quietism with which all these issues are being accepted. Pope Francis put it so well when he warned us that we should be worried if we have come to a point when our consciences are anesthetized. This year of 2017 surely suggests a deep reflection that will lead to a different set of actions. A deep reflection not only on our present position, but on our very future. The year 2016 was a wake-up call for all of us who believe in the extension of a global order based on multilateralism and the rule of law. Such a global order as might be built on a recognition of our interdependency, shared vulnerabilities. And that recognition seems to be receding from our horizon in the early days of 2017. In an atmosphere of fading trust, we seem unable to extricate ourselves from what has failed us. To see what we claimed as rational has disappointed us, has indeed again and again come to be defined as little more than consistency in the pursuit of an abstraction, a set of assumptions held with such fervour as to constitute, albeit an unstated one, an ideology of anesthetized moral concern. The models we accepted as singular have produced misery and insecurity, and while rewarding insatiability, they have failed to encourage cohesion, not to speak of advancing or attaining it in our global community. And then too, in what could be described as institutional atrophy, we have become frozen in models that are failing us above all else in terms of that very cohesion we need. An inability to nurture a pluralism of scholarship, indeed often to oppose it, has led to a quenching of critical capacity, to a paucity of policy options that are needed. The anesthetized conscience is the poor defense we encounter when we are confronted with a rationalization of what is irrational, but which is refused to be questioned. The language we must use, I think, that we use is important to us. It must connect to the wisdom we have come to share and to the diverse sources that can be encountered in particular versions of that wisdom. We can never afford to forget that peace, prosperity, and equality are fundamentally based on justice. We as independent nations, of course, address these issues, as you have heard, through the institutions, for example, of the European Union, the Council of Europe, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But the UN is the pinnacle of multilateralism in our schema. And while it has enormous life-saving achievements to its credit, its name, it is today neither adequately funded nor connected to the citizens who depend on its moral authority. Most alarmingly, in the eyes of so many of the excluded, the poor, or simply concerned peoples of the world, it seems to lack an institutional structure of efficacy that can make new forms of capital accountable nationally, regionally, or globally. More worrying still, it is attacked on occasion by the most powerful and frustrated in its moral purpose by the blatant pursuit of interests by the most powerful. One of the greatest achievements of the United Nations historically was to make common cause on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which for the first time set out the universal protection of fundamental human rights. But can, as it says in the opening, we the peoples honestly say that the ambitions of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration have been fulfilled? Or that they are even now recognized as an aim to be fulfilled? And what does our promise, quote, to promote social progress and better standards of life mean to young girls in forgotten crises? And why do more than 130 million people need humanitarian assistance to survive? The Dean is referred to 1916. I welcome that, Grimila Margaret. But idealism is based on best instincts, drawing on received wisdoms, and sometimes also to combine necessarily with the capacity for building from an emancipatory imagination. The utopian instinct should never be dismissed as idle speculation. As you've heard me, and as you've heard the Dean, should we not all agree that we do indeed need to envisage how to get to a better place? Utopos. A better place. Here in Ireland, in the year of 2016, we celebrated the centenary indeed of dramatic events which hastened the creation of our own state. When we remember the leaders of the Easter Rising, the founders of the state, and too many quiet, previously unsung heroines and heroes who took part in our revolutionary struggle. That period of reflection brought to light the important and often forgotten role played by women in forging the Ireland of today. The 1916 proclamation itself called for a republic that would guarantee, I quote, religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities for all citizens. Our republic is, of course, a work in progress, and the freedoms we have been gifted by it are moral and ethical obligations for each successive generation. And they in turn pose profound questions about fairness and inclusiveness, not just to citizens of Ireland, but for all of us as citizens of the world. 2016 was a year in which the Irish people recommitted themselves to the ideals of the state's founding fathers. And may I suggest to you, likewise, 2017 might be the year in which we, the members of the United Nations, recommit ourselves to honouring in full the pledges made in the UN Charter. We can open a dialogue with the cosmwinter of the world, la gente del basso, the excluded, the disappointed, the angry. Above all, we cannot abandon those excluded, confused, to the predatory abuse of those who seek the exploitation of difference of race, ethnicity, culture, or gender. There can be no room for such abuse. We have in Europe and elsewhere experienced the consequences of that already. And we as peoples, as heads of states or diplomats, cannot ignore the agony of humanity that cries out to us for belief in the capacity of the human spirit to feel, imagine, and create what I call a civilization of sufficiency. In claiming that it is enough to adjust to what is failing, in declaring our times to be post-ideological, we are being the most ideological generation in decades. The disquieted publics of the world must not be abandoned to demagoguery. Rather, they must be invited to be partners in responding to interdependency in the new conditions of this century. For all these reasons and more, I have communicated and wished every success to Antonio Guterres, the new Secretary General of the United Nations, in facing the challenges ahead. I take it as a hopeful sign that he has been quick to acknowledge that many have lost confidence in global institutions, including the United Nations itself. The Secretary General has argued that it was time for the United Nations to recognize its shortcomings and to reform the way it works. And we must be ready to work with him on those reforms. He has already made some wonderful and very hopeful appointments in the areas of development and refugee welfare. We must now avoid any renewed deflection of resources from the tasks of humanity towards the tasks of war. We must instead work harder to undo the legacy of previous wars. Last November, while on state visits to Vietnam and Laos, PDR, I saw for myself the devastating impact of war on a country and the much longer-term effects of unexploded ordnance. In 2016, there was, I think, a major and welcome progress in strengthening the instruments of international humanitarian law, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Cluster Munitions Convention. The Convention on Conventional Weapons also made progress at its recent review conference, and I welcome the early entry into force and consolidation of the work of the Arms Trade Treaty. Yet while all this is indeed positive, and it is facing our challenges, it is scarcely sufficient, nor is it adequately reflecting the urgency of our times. So much remains to be done. During my visit to Vietnam and Laos, I recognized that at the present rate of decommissioning unexploded ordnance, it would take the people of Laos 250 years for it to be safe to go into the fields that they need to till for food. Can we not use technology, science, and international cooperation to speed up such tasks as this? I do want to record, of course, encourage strongly the progress we have made. I'm very proud that Ireland, together with our partners, has sponsored a groundbreaking resolution at the United Nations to begin negotiations this year on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. Building on Ireland's enduring tradition of strong support and advocacy on nuclear disarmament, this new treaty is intended to complement and reinforce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and offer new hope that the world can finally be free from the threat posed by these weapons to the future of humanity. And we have to get to that new place. And then another area of multilateral progress, which we must welcome, has been on climate change. The greatest significance at COP21 was that the scientific reality of climate change was accepted in this universal, legally binding agreement. COP21, as of course, did leave a number of issues to be resolved, but as I said to this very audience last year, we can all see that it is a great achievement when viewed through the lens of the disappointing failures of the past. It truly represents a turning point in the climate crisis, a powerful, irreversible moment. And I think as well, it deserves the support of a great movement. The climate justice movement is now global. So many people have started to change their consumption patterns, and thousands of cities, provinces, and regions around the world have committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And all these are, of course, most welcome developments. But remember, these agreements were made in the name of the peoples of the world. They belong to the peoples of the world, who will need, if necessary, to be mobilized for their defense and their implementation. Then, during this last year and into this, for millions of children, women and men who are on the move on our planet, global leadership fell very short in 2016. We've seen a terrible loss of life, the displacement of entire communities, including those pertaining to small and ancient cultures, such as the Yazidis, a member of whom came to see me here in Áras, Uachtaráin, to tell the story. And we've seen the net destruction of civilian infrastructure in armed conflict and natural disasters too across the world. And thus, when I represented Ireland at the World Humanitarian Summit in May in Istanbul, I was heartened by the commitment voiced by so many nations to alleviating this suffering to which I've just referred. But even the most effective humanitarian response is a lesser achievement than the prevention or the halting of the conflicts which made it necessary. Yet as we speak, the World Food Programme is today left short of funds and has had to cut the meagre rations of 1.4 million displaced people in Iraq. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that over 17 million people are currently in crisis, and emergency food insecurity levels in member countries of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, namely Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda, which are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. And escaping from that may now be prevented by some authorities. Currently, close to 12 million people across Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are in need of food assistance. Much of Somalia, northeastern coastal Kenya, southeast of Ethiopia as well as the Afar region are still to recover from El Nino-induced drought of 2015-16, while South Sudan and Darfur region of Sudan are facing protracted insecurity, driven on by these conditions. The end of the year was darkened by the fall of Aleppo, with the cries for help of countless civilians going unheeded in the midst of a brutal conflict. The global system is perceived as having failed these men, women, and children, and we cannot and must not turn our back on their suffering. For the world's diplomats and government agencies, a humanitarian response is of course essential, but it is never sufficient. We must get beyond reaction and achieve more structural analyses of future trends, including, for example, demography, population. If we are failing to understand migration now, not recognizing, so rarely you find it referred to, the positive contribution to migrants to so many economies and peoples. For example, that migrants in 2016 produced just short of 10% of total global output. How will we deal with the changes that might be underway in the future? In 1950, the United States, Canada, and Europe accounted for 29% of world population. In 2015, this has fallen to 15%, and it is projected it will decrease further to 12.5% by 2050. Africa, which had 7.5% of the world's general population in 1900, 9% in 1950, 15% in 2015, will be at 24% by 2050, and for 2100, estimates range between 25% and 40%. We must come to understand migration, both voluntary and involuntary, and this need never be, of course, at the cost of humanitarian response or obligation or what is immediate. I'm so pleased that in 2016, the Irish Defence Forces, in response, deployed 3 naval vessels to the Mediterranean, dragging from the sea over 7,000 migrants. Here in Ireland, we are justifiably proud of the life-saving work of our defence forces, but I know that our citizens, as I speak to them, are concerned too at what is causing that migration: extreme poverty, conflict, ethnic cleansing, and natural disasters. In Istanbul, I suggested that leaving no one behind is a humanitarian imperative, but it may be too weak. But I am pleased that Ireland led the response last year, together with Jordan, acting as co-facilitators of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. The declaration delivered a strong message of solidarity and contains detailed commitments which could ensure a more humane, dignified and compassionate response by the international community to the plight of refugees and migrants, which are all of our concern. But of course, we must now turn promises into action and deliver little less than a strong global compact on refugees. All of us must realise, of course, that implementing an adequate response to climate change and having a new sustainable development strategy that deals in a just way with issues of trade, debt, environmental protection, intellectual and spiritual freedom, as well as cultural diversity, will have an influence on the future shape of migratory flows. I very much welcome the increased centrality in policy discussions of the consequences of unaddressed inequality. Globalization in its current version, now failing, has raised many from poverty and increased global wealth, but it has also brought political and economic turmoil in its wake. Tragically, for many people left behind, the premium attached to being born in a rich country is still too high. In his seminal book, Global Inequality, from Harvard University Press, Professor Branko Milanovic pointed out last year that, for example, African countries do grow, but often have sudden and sharp declines. The inability to sustain this growth through long periods is directly affected by externalities. I speak of debt and trade. And all too often, not only conflicts, but falls in commodity prices are behind these declines. We have not allowed a general context to emerge that allows for sustainable growth. We have neglected issues of debt, fair trade, and duties in terms of taxation, particularly in the area of extractive industries. My good friend Carlos Lopez, the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Commission for Africa, has identified inequality between groups as the main cause of conflict within that continent, which he reckons is costing Africa more than 2% of annual GDP growth. And as to conflict, Dr. Lopez has noted that only 8 of the African Union's member states have not been affected by conflict since independence, and the toll paid on the continent for that has been enormous. Branko Milanovic argues that the advocates of globalization in its early days had insisted that it would make access to technology and best economic practices easier for poorer countries. But he points to a fundamental contradiction in the globalization that we have seen to date, in that it implies the movement of factors of production, and particularly of capital, goods, and increasingly services, but it has not been true of labor. Yet it is precisely in left-out regions such as Africa that we will see the biggest demographic changes, with 50% of the population increase on our planet between now and 2050 taking place on that continent. Africa, the youthful continent, must be allowed to be the continent of opportunity for all Africans, and in doing so it will be a contribution for all of their fellow global citizens. Young African people must be enabled to make a decent living in their own communities. The continent is required by the demographic projections to create 18 million new jobs per annum. It is today providing 2 million. The African Union Summit, which closes in Addis Ababa today, has just declared 2017 the Year of Youth. This is most timely, and I hope that the European Union Africa Summit in the autumn which will have youth issues as a major theme, will deliver concrete actions to tackle this huge demographic challenge, but also this great opportunity that exists, not only for Africa, but for humanity. We can do something ethical and new, empowering the young people of the continent, like young people here or in any part of the world, to take charge, allowing pluralist scholarship, models to coexist. Then too, although advocates in its current form will claim that globalization can be credited with reducing inequality between countries, I say it slowly. The very opposite has happened, as you know well. Within some developed countries where inequality has widened dramatically, the undisputed winners from globalization as we've had it in those countries are of course the very richest. Very often elites enriching themselves in the midst of the poverty of their people all over the planet, who've made dramatic gains in both absolute and relative terms. The relative losers have included the less affluent groups in some OECD countries, prompting, as many would argue, widespread discontent, alienation, and anger, which gained such prominence in 2016. Cohesion must become the project for all of us, and surely it is the best bedrock for secure living in a public world where people want to experience democracy. May I suggest that a future reinvigorated institutional order might well draw on a regionalised set of initiatives. For example, we should be considering migrating science and technology in innovative clusters to Africa and Asia as part of our global sharing, a science and technology without borders. Our old forms of industrial revolution and hegemony in trade, they're over. We now need at global level to build an ethical globalization that recognizes interdependency and that respects diverse sources of wisdom, including the legacies of intuitive wisdom. If we are to deliver a sustainable future, we surely urgently need to recognize opportunities and release science and technology to assist in that task. In Europe and the United States, deepening inequalities have betrayed the commitment to cohesion upon which so many hopes have been placed. Racism and xenophobia are gaining ground, exploiting fears and ignorance in ways that could destroy democracy itself. Inequalities and the exclusions they breed are now being exploited by extremists, preaching claims to exclusive forms of propriety and entitlement, which ignore the fundamental truth that we are all but migrants in time and space, who can best flourish in sufficiency, creativity, and how we destroy ourselves and our planet through mindless insatiability in untested models of connection between economics and ecology. Our gaze from all this must not be averted. We must be open to the agony of our fellow occupants of this fragile planet. There is an urgent need, too, to look into the deep and quiet corners of those lives deprived of a right to participate at any level of society, because these lives deserve, again in the words of Pope Francis, a dignified welcome. Indeed, at a time when identity politics is surfacing its ugly head again, we might recall those elegant and prescient words of Shemisini, who was invited as a poet to speak when the European Union celebrated in a great moment just over 10 years ago the arrival of new member states from Central and Eastern Europe. Shemis wrote, "So on a day when newcomers appear, let it be a homecoming, and let us speak the unstrange word as it behoves us here. Move lips, move minds, and make new meanings flare." Dear friends, Ireland is anxious to have an adequate discourse on all of these issues that I have mentioned. In 2020, Ireland will be a candidate for election to the UN Security Council, and we will be seeking the support of your governments for our candidature. But we do believe that our values and principles and our steadfast commitment to the UN will enable us to make a valuable contribution to the work of the Council. Many of the institutions which enshrine the ideals we subscribe to today, we should remember, were created so soon after the Second World War, during a period of great economic and political challenge. It would have been understandable to some then if the victors, the vanquished and the countless victims of the war had simply retreated into their own jurisdictions, be it as the victors or the vanquished, but they didn't. The need for collective action was recognised, and that our imperfect world is a better place today because of far-sighted and imaginative arrangements put in place then by brave, long-sighted women and men. It needed an inspired generation of diplomats and political leaders to make it happen. And that is where we are today. That is what we need again today. We must set about the necessary change, and we should be firm in defending our achievements. We must ensure respect for a rules-based approach to international order and protect the international acquis, that complex set of treaties and resolutions which form the basis for our global solidarity today. We need to be steadfast and vocal in our defense of what are legally binding commitments and challenge anyone, even those with loud and powerful voices, who may seek in pursuit of short-term interests or populism to dismiss them as in any sense optional. They are not. They are the achievements of the international order. Further reforms are, of course, needed. We saw recently, for example, what can be achieved when vetoes are not employed. Far too often we've seen conflicts prolonged, lives lost, untold misery visited on the innocent by the deployment of vetoes. Ireland would prefer if vetoes were abolished completely, but recognising that progress is likely to be incremental in this regard, we've been actively associated with initiatives in New York to limit their use in the first instance. We've also offered ideas on broadening the membership of the Security Council in order to make it more reflective of the contemporary rather than the post-war world. Broader representation would, in its own way, be a first step, perhaps, towards addressing some of the inequalities that bedevil the world and the institutional inadequacies to which I have referred. The loss of trust we currently see on the European street is alarming. The public presentation of accommodations reached between representatives of governments at times, the formal text of policy instruments used by the Union, have at times had the effect of separating European institutions from the people they represent. The discourse has not reached the street. The words lack moral political choices or intent. Often they constitute a mask for failure, confusion, impotence, or even evasion in the face of challenges regional and global. And then if political parties lose support, the people can decide to remove them at election time. Where we are now, however, is this. If it is the institutions that lose popular support, what results is a legitimation crisis of an entirely different order, one that can threaten democracy itself. As President of Ireland, an ancient European culture and people, I firmly believe that we need to widen the debate about what we mean when we talk of Europe. The choices between recovering a flexibility and moral intention that will be democratically accountable, or remaining transfixed, anaesthetized, waiting for the system to be overturned. At its best, Europe can be, it is my profound conviction, become renewed as a project based on humanistic, egalitarian values of dialogue and integration that can appeal to all generations of Europeans and their fellow citizens. And what an antidote that would be to the current hegemony of the politics of fear. For irrespective of its failings and imperfections, the European Union remains a visionary and vital project, one which has helped preserve peace, one that can create a common sense of purpose among Europeans, and its values remain at the heart of our approach to the world. The challenges facing the Union over the year ahead may be acute, but to my mind this creates more space, not less, for a renewed and mobilized European discourse, heralding values of justice, positive internationalism and cooperation. And as I come to the end, it is important that in critically assessing the Union, as we must do, we do not allow ourselves to be misrepresented even for a second. We are for its strengthening, its increased efficiency, its greater connection with the European street, and never in any sense as advocates for its destruction. The context of the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the Union simply means that we must be resolute in mitigating and overcoming any negative consequences for the Union and for our Irish people. We are particularly mindful in this regard of the circumstances of Northern Ireland, a place which is a living example of the positive impact of the European Union membership in supporting and framing our peace process. Recent political developments have resulted in an election in Northern Ireland, and there is always a risk that old divisions may come to the forefront in the forthcoming campaign. This combines with concerns about the impact of Brexit on a region which, while transformed over the past 2 decades, is not yet fully reconciled or where healing has finished. And it should remind us again, as if we needed it, of the relative fragility of peace. However, the institutions and principles of an international binding treaty, the Good Friday Agreement, are comprehensive and robust, and I believe that the people of Northern Ireland expect their politicians to work together effectively so that the full promise of the choice made by the people of this island in 1998 can be realised and sustained and built upon. That democratic endorsement is a powerful one, which reminds us that even in times of difficulty, we have a duty of hope. Mars Fokelsker Conclica Carlish and made the Tolerone to finish. Your good selves. The duty of hope is something which I know is very familiar to all of you in your work as government representatives. And I do want to pay tribute to that work that you and the diplomatic community undertake day in, day out, as you seek to advance the international agenda. Yours is always, will always be a demanding role that can at times must seem thankless and even dangerous profession. Building friendships, fostering understanding and finding peaceful solutions are the makings of your professional lives. I like to see you as the people who so often are trying to keep doors open when others are rushing to close them. However, it is the inescapable duty of politicians too to suggest the outline of that shared house in ethical space that we are all seeking to construct and inhabit. Sometimes it seems to me that on the ground a good diplomat remains someone who has genuine empathy for the foreign society in which she or he lives and works acting as a knowledge broker with the capacity to read cultural and ideological complexity as context and to empathise with the point of view of the local people so as to better communicate the positions of the country he or she represents. I would like, therefore, to thank you once again for the vital role you are performing in fostering understanding and cooperation between our nations. And I would ask all of you to please convey the good wishes of the Irish people to all of those whom you represent so well. Garamahake.